Olá, é muito bom ter você aqui com a gente. Hoje nós vamos entrevistar a professora Christine Dumais. Ela é professora de História e Estudos de Gênero na Calvin University. E ela é uma das autoras mais vendidas dos Estados Unidos, segundo o New York Times, pelo menos desde o ano passado, quando ela lançou seu livro Jesus e John Wayne, Como os Evangélicos Brancos Corromperam a Fé e Fraturaram uma Nação. Esse livro é uma análise muito poderosa que demonstra como as pautas reacionárias e conservadoras dos nossos evangélicos brancos não vêm da Bíblia, mas de um objetivo e de uma agenda que busca acumular poder e riquezas para os seus líderes, que vem desde o século passado nos Estados Unidos. Esperamos que vocês gostem. Professora Christine, você poderia descrever o termo evangelicalismo branco?
So one of the things that I do in this book is challenge the way that scholars have defined white evangelical up till now. So traditionally, white evangelicals are defined through their theology. And so if you look at the National Association of Evangelicals website, they'll define themselves according to their beliefs. So they believe in the authority of the Bible, or biblicism. They emphasize crucicentrism, or the centrality of the cross of Christ, conversionism, this born-again experience, and then evangelism and activism, so acting out of these beliefs. And what I came to realize is that didn't really capture what I was observing as a cultural historian, looking at 20th century evangelicalism up to contemporary evangelicalism. What I saw was more of a historical and cultural movement, and it was not a movement defined chiefly by its theology. And I came to understand white evangelicalism largely as a consumer culture, and as a series of networks and alliances. So this includes evangelical churches. It also includes Christian media empires, Christian publishing industry, Christian radio. And so what it means to be an evangelical for me as a cultural historian is to be immersed in this consumer culture, in this evangelical subculture. You might attend an evangelical church, you might attend a mainline church and still be immersed in this consumer culture. You might not even attend church at all. And so that's, and it's not that theology is not relevant. Theology does come to play, but it is a theology that is filtered through this consumer culture, and a theology that is very much shaped by cultural allegiances and also political allegiances.
Você poderia nos explicar a diferença entre cultura e teologia entre os evangélicos brancos?
Well, I think maybe a way to explain this is to show kind of the problem with just the pure theological definition. So if you go with that kind of 4-point definition that I just outlined, which by the way is called the Bebbington Quadrilateral for history buffs, because historian David Bebbington kind of termed that and came up with this rubric. And a lot of scholars will use that to define evangelicalism. The trouble with it is that if you take that rubric of theological beliefs and then you can find that the majority of Black Protestants in the United States check all those boxes. Now, the problem is that the vast majority of Black Protestants in the United States do not identify as evangelicals. and they don't, because they know that there's more to being an evangelical than simply checking those boxes, right? And even if you take a look at those things, so the authority of the scriptures, what do we really mean by that? You scratch beneath the surface and you can see that the scriptures, the passages and the interpretations that are really important to white evangelicals are not necessarily those that are really important in the same way and interpreted in the same way to Black Christians. Same thing if you look at crucicentrism, the centrality of Jesus Christ. Who is Christ to them? How do they understand Jesus? Is Jesus a suffering servant? Is Jesus a warrior leading his followers into battle? Or let's look at activism, right? So how do Christians act out of these beliefs? How do they put their faith into action? There you can see this huge racial divide in the United States in terms of social and political commitments of Black Protestants or Black quote unquote evangelicals and white evangelicals. And so there's so much difference that this kind of theological rubric obscures. At the same time, you talk about the authority of the scriptures and the centrality of the cross. And there are a lot of Christians worldwide who would say, oh, yeah, I believe in all those things too. Right. When I ask my students, some of whom identify as an evangelical, some of whom don't, some are coming from Catholic backgrounds, like a wide array. And they see that rubric and they kind of say, isn't that just all Christians, right? And so what's really distinctive about that? And that's where, in my research, I look at how theology interacts with these cultural allegiances and participation in a broader movement.
Falando sobre essas tendências culturais e alianças, como você vê essa tensão entre essas instituições e a cultura de consumo evangélica? De que forma elas têm colaborado ou se enfrentado na construção de um movimento evangélico branco?
This consumer culture, it didn't just spring up organically. Back in 1942, with the formation of the National Association of Evangelicals, a lot of evangelical leaders came together, conservative Protestants, and decided that they were doing good work in their own spaces, but they thought that they could do much more if they banded together. And this was in the aftermath of the fundamentalists modernist controversy. A lot of them had failed to maintain control of mainline denominations. And so they had been kind of scattered. And they decided in the 40s to come together to reassert their influence over American culture. And they had a lot of plans, and they made it very clear in their documents. So they wanted to use the media to reach into all corners of American society, the radio in particular, to take to the airwaves. They wanted to have magazines, Christian magazines, with subscribers in the tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands. They wanted to have Christian bookstores across the country and in big cities, but also in small towns. They had all these plans. What was really remarkable as a historian going back and reading that, from 1942, is to realize that within 15 years, they had accomplished all of those things to a remarkable extent. And so you have the Christian Booksellers Association that is formed that makes it possible for these little Christian bookstores to spring up all across the country, even in the tiniest towns. I grew up in a very small town, 6,000 people. We had one bookstore in town, and it was a Christian bookstore, right? And so that's where we got our gifts. That's where we got our books. And so you also have your institutions here. You've got parachurch organizations, very important in evangelicalism. I mean, you do have some evangelical denominations, but evangelicalism is really held together by these parachurch organizations, by these big Christian publishers, by Christian radio, and that's the kind of networks and alliances that I'm talking about, that I'm looking at. So you have an institutional base. But then you have this consumer culture, and they intersect, right? So you have something like the Southern Baptist Convention, incredibly influential kind of evangelical denomination, although technically they're not a denomination, but function largely as a denomination. And then they have their own publishing arm, Lifeway Christian Books. Right, hugely important, and all Christians from other denominations are going to be purchasing books through Lifeway as well, and books published. So there you have this overlap between the institutional and this consumer culture. But it's not a perfect overlap. And then what happens is this consumer culture just washes across American Christianity. Again, you can be attending a mainline church, but they're going to be, chances are, might be buying their Christian books and Bible studies from Lifeway Christian Books. And so the influence is going to go into mainline churches. Christian radio reaches everywhere, and not just in the United States, also globally. And so what you have then is the creation of a populist movement in many ways, where consumers can receive this teaching direct into their homes, through their radios, through their magazines, and through their Bible study books, and so their own churches might not have as much power over their faith formation as this consumer culture does. And that's exactly what we saw happening in these last few years. When you look at pastors really struggling to, pastors who thought they were the leaders in their congregations, and even leaders of denominations who thought that, they had power here and they had authority over the people in their churches. And what they realized is that they didn't, that they weren't actually leading because the people weren't following, because they were getting their information from Christian radio. They were getting their information from talk radio or from Fox News, and maybe from their favorite celebrity preacher, not from the pastor in their own church that they heard for maybe 20, 25 minutes once a week at best. And so I think there was a real crisis of authority that was revealed within evangelical churches over the past few years, where a lot of pastors realized that they actually had very little influence over the people in their own churches, in their own pews. And so it's a complicated relationship between institutions and the consumer culture. But I think it's really important that we understand how this all works.
Então, quanto a essa cultura de consumo aqui no Brasil, nós temos visto muitos movimentos cristãos que são bastante progressistas em liturgia e estética, mas eles são realmente reacionários quando o assunto é gênero e política. O quão difundido isso é nos Estados Unidos? Eles já tiveram sucesso em reunir o público jovem?
We have the same thing here. We have had it for a long time. And it can be really deceptive because from the outside and to kind of the casual visitor, it can seem like, well, this has to be a progressive church, right? There's nothing stodgy about this preacher wearing tight jeans and expensive sneakers, and it's all very hip and very modern, and there's contemporary music and really high quality music, and you can talk Hillsong, or I think the best example of this that I write about in Jesus and John Wayne, it was Mark Driscoll's Mars Hill Church. Right? It seemed so hip and modern, and it was out in Seattle, and it was bringing in the unchurched, and it just had this feel of being kind of just really edgy and even rebellious. So of course it would be kind of progressive, right? This isn't the old religious right, but it really was in terms of its politics, in terms of its theology. And it was every bit as retrograde, if not more, in those respects, particularly around issues of gender and sexuality. And so, yes, this is a common thing because there's an emphasis on reaching the culture, on being culturally relevant, and so you want to be attractive. There's also, I think, an element of power here, right? You don't want to be ridiculed. You don't want to look like you're out of touch. You want the best music. You want the best buildings. You want the coolest pastor. You want the pastor who can hang out with, Hollywood stars. And that's, justified in terms of outreach, in terms of evangelism. And so you want that power, and you tell yourself so that you can use it for the good. But this kind of attractive Christianity as a tool for witnessing is very common. And it fits very well, actually, with conservative theology, or with this conservative cultural identity, which does place a lot of emphasis on, if you look at gender roles for women needing to be very beautiful, being very attractive, and not at all kind of frumpy. And again, it's like you are witnessing that for the goodness of your faith, and for men being powerful, being strong, being very masculine and attractive too. So I think that's quite common. But yes, this kind of hip style can absolutely masquerade very conservative theology and politics.
Então, você fala muito em seu livro sobre essa masculinidade tóxica e o nacionalismo cristão que é difundido entre os evangélicos brancos. Você poderia nos dizer mais sobre quais comportamentos e crenças estão inclusos nesse pacote?
Glad that you hold those together, because I just started the research for this book thinking I was just going to write about evangelical masculinity, and then at a certain point I realized I'm actually also writing about race. This is white Christian masculinity. And I realized I was also writing about Christian nationalism because they're so tightly intertwined in conservative evangelicalism. And this goes back to the Cold War context, where in the late 40s, so evangelicals are coming together, reasserting themselves, and during the Second World War, but then very quickly that comes to an end, and we're in the early Cold War. And at that point, communism was a real threat, and it was perceived as a threat, and it was sold as a threat that Americans needed to awaken to, and evangelicals, along with many other Americans, took this threat very seriously. And for evangelicals in particular, communism was a dire threat because it was anti-God, anti-family, and anti-American. It's how it was seen. And so all of the things that they held most dear. And they thought that they had a special role to play in defending against communism as Christians, as evangelical Christians, as the most faithful Christians, right? They were this faithful remnant. They hadn't maintained control of major denominations. And so they thought they had the special role to play to keep America Christian and to keep America strong. And you needed strong men to defend America because this was a real threat, and it was a military threat. So the defense needed to be military. And so you did need strong men to defend Christian America. See how these things are just so tightly intertwined. Now, the thing is, in the late 40s and in the 1950s, these values were not unique to conservative white evangelicals. This was the Cold War consensus era. This was the post-war baby boom. And so a lot of Americans kind of held these values in common. And for this reason, this really enabled evangelicals to assert their influence and to move closer to the center of American society and American politics. And right, this is a time where we have Billy Graham in and out of the Eisenhower White House and collaborating and again, really asserting their influence. All of that changed in the 1960s. And in the 1960s, you have the civil rights movement, which disrupts the racial status quo, particularly for Southern white evangelicals. And you have the feminist movement that challenges this gender traditionalism that conservative evangelicals held dear, that men are protectors and providers. And this gender difference was very important, and women are weak and submissive and have to be protected. And then you also have the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement. And conservative evangelicals, that's when they doubled down on all of these values, whereas many Americans started to question, right? They start to embrace feminism and question gender traditionalism. They're absolutely questioning American foreign policy and the goodness and greatness of the American nation and the American military. And again, evangelicals are doubling down on these values. And that's when these values become oppositional values. So they hold these dear over against other Americans. And they see themselves again as this faithful remnant, but the stakes are incredibly high. Now, where this all came together then was the assertion of white patriarchal authority. This really holds all of these things together. White patriarchal authority, the authority of white parents, particularly white fathers, to make decisions for their children, that comes to bear in terms of anti-desegregation activism of evangelicals, right, working to defend segregated schools, anti-feminism, and pro-war. And the feminist movement was seen as a real threat to the nation, not just to godly families and to traditional homes, but it was also seen as a threat to national security. Because what was going wrong on the battlefields in Vietnam? Why couldn't American men defeat a ragtag enemy, right, on in the jungles of Vietnam? What was going wrong? So clearly the emasculation of American men was a problem, and clearly it was up to this faithful remnant, to conservative evangelicals, to not just keep the faith strong, but also keep American manhood strong. And this is the rhetoric they're using, right? Is they're talking about how to raise children, how to raise boys. You got to teach them to play with guns, and then teach them how to use real firearms. And you need to toughen them up because the fate of the nation depends on them.
Quais são os principais argumentos bíblicos ou teológicos utilizados pelos líderes evangélicos para defender essa masculinidade tóxica e esse nacionalismo cristão?
For patriarchy, there are many interpretations of various verses to assert and defend patriarchy as God's will. And there's a long history of that in Christianity and in evangelicalism. I will also say there's a long history of biblical interpretation in Christian history and also in evangelicalism that subverts patriarchy and that labels patriarchy as a result of sin and of rebellion against God, and that sees in the scriptures that the will of God is actually for egalitarian relationships between women and men. My first book is on the history of Christian feminism, so I can say that with some confidence, and know that so evangelicals. Conservative evangelicals will, again, self-identify as Bible-believing Christians, and the authority of the scriptures is so important in their understanding and their interpretation. Their literal inerrantist view of the scriptures defends patriarchy, although there is another tradition that also asserts the inerrant authority of the scriptures that interprets the scriptures in actually the opposite way when it comes to gender. And then in terms of this kind of militarism, first of all, a lot of scriptural passages have to be ignored or dismissed. So, passages about loving your neighbor as yourselves. And I should say this militancy is both in terms of foreign policy, but also and increasingly in terms of culture wars politics. Again, since the 1960s, when this rift opens up, right, between conservative evangelicals and other white conservatives who are holding to these quote unquote traditional values over against those who are questioning American militarism and who are pursuing civil rights and who are embracing feminism. As this rift opens up, this kind of culture wars mentality also takes hold on the domestic front. And these things really go hand in hand. And so for those who embrace this militarism and this militancy of the faith, one of their favorite books of the Bible is the book of Revelation. Because you get blood and you get war, and of course there are all kinds of ways of interpreting the book of Revelation, and you have a sword, but the sword is coming out of Jesus' mouth, and what do you do with this? But they take that imagery in a very militant direction, and really embrace that. Meanwhile, they'll downplay commands to turn the other cheek. They'll explicitly say, nah, that doesn't apply here, right? You can't raise a boy to be a strong man by teaching him to turn the other cheek. So, love your neighbors as yourselves, welcome the stranger, right? These are our teachings, or even fear not, do not be afraid. These are teachings that are really kind of, central to Christianity. Those are kind of set aside or explained away, whereas this kind of us versus them militancy is what really is embraced.
Você menciona no seu livro que as famílias nos Estados Unidos, antes das décadas de 1930, 1940, eram famílias compostas, em sua maioria, por várias gerações, que só mais tarde elas se tornaram a família do sonho americano, como nós conhecemos hoje. Você pode nos contar sobre essa transição e como os evangélicos apoiaram esse modelo familiar como ideal bíblico?
Yeah, this ideal of the nuclear family, which really, again, it's not just evangelicals who are embracing this in the post-war era, post-World War II era. It's many Americans. And this is when you have a lot of money from the federal government, making it possible, this post-war prosperity, making it possible for many families to buy their first home, to move out into the suburbs. The economy is booming, and so it's possible for this male breadwinner role for many men to achieve that, at least for a time. All of these things are kind of aberrations, right? These are new developments coming out of World War II, coming out before that, the Depression, and so these traditional values are actually quite quite new, at least as they're being lived by middle-class white suburban Americans in the 1950s. But this becomes the ideal, and this male breadwinner and female homemaker kind of fundamental gender difference becomes, for evangelicals, the most fundamental kind of building block of society, as they understand God ordained the social order, and which, as a historian, right, this is just it's almost bizarre, because throughout so much of human history, right, this is not how things worked. Even within American history, I teach my students about colonial households and what that looked like. And yeah, you could call the colonial wife a housewife. She was engaged from sunup till past sundown in productive labor that was absolutely essential for the survival of the family. And husbands, were working often in the home, in the area around the home, and they were working together in gardening and farming, and so even in our own country's history, you have very different model of productive labor and of gender arrangements. It's not until industrialization happens that you have men working predominantly outside the home and working for wages. And women, by the way, are still generally working inside the home in the 19th century, still doing productive labor, but it's no longer really appreciated as productive labor because you aren't getting a paycheck. But you still need the wash done. You still need the cooking done. You still have to raise those kids. And it's no longer defined as productive labor. So this is a very recent kind of historical development. And that's the relationship, or the kind of understanding that characterizes this post-war, almost this kind of throwback to this Victorian gender arrangement in a mythical form. And that's what evangelicals embrace as the God-ordained social order. And they insist, right, the book upon book upon book and radio program insists that to be a God-honoring family, women must stay home, out of the workforce, stay home and raise their children. Men have to be the sole breadwinner. That might work in the 1950s if you're white and middle class. For anybody else, it doesn't work already then. And with a post-industrial economy by the 1970s, it's incredibly hard for many white middle-class families to support that. And yet this is still the ideal that's held up as God-ordained, as biblical, and as timeless. And there's then all these layers of expectations get added onto that. So the man has to be the provider and the protector. And he loses his job, or he gets, his wages go down. Right? That gets at his very masculinity, and his faithful Christian manhood comes into question. Women, on the other hand, are meant to be, again, not in the workforce, not paid laborers, not having careers at least. And they are to be beautiful and supportive and submissive and really devote themselves to their husbands. And again, this is all packaged and sold as timeless, as biblical, and domesticity is their be all end all. And that in the 1950s and 60s looks like having the perfect house and making Jell-O salads that are ready to serve when the husband comes home. And right, there's all these layers. But again, this is all packaged and sold as biblical and timeless. And millions of American evangelicals pattern their lives around these visions of masculinity and femininity, and think that in doing so, they are obeying God.
Ainda nesse assunto de família tradicional, você também conta no seu livro que o movimento de pureza sexual foi em parte impulsionado com recursos do governo federal, desde o presidente Ronald Reagan até o presidente Bush, o que foi realmente surpreendente para mim. Você poderia nos dizer mais sobre essa parceria promovendo a pureza sexual? Como os líderes evangélicos e o governo se beneficiaram com isso?
Yeah, that's so funny. I've given so many interviews and nobody's actually asked about that, but it's really, it's quite important. And so what you see is this sexual purity movement that, again, there are traditional Christian teachings about sexuality and sexual restraint and marriage and so on. So this is not an utter invention, but then the shape and form that it takes in this literature becomes really distinctive because it's sexual purity is very much filtered through this gender difference. So men and women are absolutely different, and men are filled with testosterone, so they are aggressive, and that's the way God made them. And they also have a very aggressive sex drive, and that's just the way God made them. And restraint really isn't their thing. Boys will be boys. Meanwhile, women, right, God made very differently, and women don't have this sex drive, and it's up to women to protect virtue. And so it's up to women to not seduce men who are not their husbands, not to tempt them. So you have to dress very modestly, and if a man slips up, it's a woman's fault. And meanwhile, it's the wife's responsibility. Once you marry, it is your responsibility to meet your husband's every sexual need, because again, men have this aggressive sex drive, and it has to be met one way or another. And so this sets up this really problematic sexual ethic that men can be quite abusive and aggressive, and will not be held responsible for their actions because clearly it was a woman's fault. Either she seduced him. Even young girls are accused of seducing their abusers, and wives are accused of not fulfilling their husband's sexual needs, so that he was forced to go outside of marriage to satisfy himself. So that's like the kind of sexual ethic that develops based on this core belief of gender difference, and that emerges already in the it harkens back to 19th century purity teachings. And interestingly, in the 19th century, Christian reformers, particularly Christian women, really worked against the sexual double standard. It was a huge movement of Christian women in the late 19th and early 20th century. But that kind of feminist Christianity or feminist critique was missing in evangelical spaces in the 1960s and 1970s, when this really starts to take hold. And by the way, evangelicals write a lot about sex. Don't be fooled. They are not prudish in that they're not going to talk about sex. Sex manuals and writings on sexuality, it's a huge business. And I read a lot of them for this book. And these teachings are just plain as day, right? That, man's aggressive sexuality, aggressive sex drive, and it's a woman's responsibility to protect virtue in the ways that I described. By the 1990s, this its kind of new iteration is this purity culture, and it becomes all the rage through this evangelical popular culture and the subculture. I mean, I grew up during this time, and so if you were an evangelical kid in youth group in the 1990s, chances are you heard about sexual purity just about every week. You were reading Josh Harris's "I Kiss Dating Goodbye," that you shouldn't even kiss before you get married. It's this biblical courtship model. Again, this is a huge industry. And yes, you had the federal government playing a role as well, because they were funding sex education and abstinence-only education. And so some of these evangelical organizations were able to get a massive amount of funding from the federal government in order to deliver this abstinence-only education, which wasn't very much sex education. It was just telling people not to have sex, and in all sorts of different ways, right? If you're a girl and you have sex before you're married, you're going to be like a piece of chewed up gum, and you'll never be able to return to that. There are so many awful metaphors out there. And so, yeah, you had the federal government funding these organizations. And so you had, it was a massive movement. And for any evangelical who's in their, 30s and 40s right now, they have stories to tell about this purity culture that they grew up in, that many of them did pattern their dating lives after. Many of them patterned their early marriages after this, and they were promised through these teachings that they would, if they saved themselves for marriage, first of all, if they didn't, they lived with this enormous amount of shame. And if they did, then they were promised the most amazing sex life ever, because God would bless their faithfulness. And so the expectations on the marriage night were incredibly high and usually not met. And so there's, I've heard so many stories even after this book has come out from evangelicals who are still really struggling to undo the damage that these teachings have done in their marriages, in their relationships. And so, yeah, it was a big business for a long time. Right now, really the last 5 or so years, we're seeing, as people have worked their way out of this culture and have been growing up and realizing this just doesn't work. And, that's some people are just completely abandoning Christianity. Some people are abandoning Christian sexual ethics. Many are not, but they're saying this is not the way to go, right? That this does so much harm, particularly with this, the amount of shame and guilt, and the sexual double standard, so right now there's like kind of this new publishing spree of evangelicals who are writing about deconstructing this purity culture, leaving this purity culture behind. There are a number of books that have come out in recent years that might be helpful resources, but that's actually quite disturbing to hear that's taking hold in Brazil right now.
Realmente parece que esse movimento focado principalmente em pureza sexual está em busca de vantagens materiais, políticas ou o que quer que seja. Então, o que você acha que eles estavam ou estão tentando alcançar com isso?
Yeah, I think that we can really start to see it can become clear what's really motivating this when we see how abuse is handled in these communities that raise their children on purity culture teachings that have, and that their children took at face value. This is what it means to be Christian. This is what it means to be holy. This is how you should live. And even if you fail, you should have lived this way, right? And then what we end up seeing in far too many cases is that for all their emphasis on sexual purity and abstinence, in fact, many men and many powerful men were getting away with horrific abuses, horrific cases of sexual abuse. And the whole last chapter of my book is detailing just a tiny sliver of the abuses that have taken place in evangelical organizations and churches and communities in the last decades. And that's where you can see that the very same people who are teaching this purity culture and teaching these very restrictive ideas of sexuality were also time and again tacitly condoning or actively protecting the abusive behavior of powerful men, and including sexual abuse and more broadly abuse of power. And this is not just one or two cases, right? This is a repeated pattern. And it's not just the case of the perpetrators doing horrible things, although the perpetrators, and there were a lot of them, did a lot of horrible things. But what really intrigued me in this research was understanding how the communities responded, right? Not the active perpetrators, the bystanders, the people in the churches, people on staff, and over again, you see the exact same pattern: blaming the victims and protecting the abuser. And it's the victims and the victims' families that end up being ostracized, forced out of these communities, and the abusers are allowed to continue in their abusive ways, with just absolutely horrific results. And so that's the important backstory to understand, what is the motivation here? Once you see those repeated patterns, you can't say that this is just a quest for holiness. This is just a quest for obedience and for living according to biblical teachings. It really does seem to be about power, about protecting certain men's power, about enforcing the submission of women, and about really protecting the privilege of those who already have a lot of power, and really reinforcing the patriarchy and patriarchal social order. And that's not where I started when I started this project. That would seem radical. It would seem extreme to make those kind of claims. That's where I ended up after seeing after years of research, and after just seeing time and again these patterns emerge. I mean, I had first started looking into this topic of evangelical masculinity and militarism back in around 2005 or 2006. And I ended up setting the project aside for a long time, for a decade. I had other things going on, had to finish another book. I had 3 kids, but I didn't stop paying attention to the guys who had first attracted my attention, who were promoting this very militant conception of Christian masculinity. And what I noticed in the ensuing decade was one after another became embroiled in scandal, abuse of power, sexual abuse, either directly or often indirectly by protecting their friends and vouching for their friends who were perpetrators. And so when I decided to pick this research back up, which was not coincidentally in the fall of 2016, I in the days after the Access Hollywood tape released, one of the first things that I did as I was picking the research back up again was actually consult a lawyer, because I knew that these stories needed to be a part of this bigger book. And at that point, this was before the Me Too era. This was before a Church Too movement, right? Where these stories made their way into the national media and garnered national attention. At this point, I had followed these stories on blogs, on survivor blogs, and so I was concerned about liability. And then it was really remarkable as I was writing this book to see one after another of these stories that I had followed for a long time get picked up by the media. And so by the time I was writing that final chapter, almost all of them had in fact been vetted by the national media because they had become national stories, or at least more than half of them had. And the rest I was able to fact check and have legal review vet for me. So, but I knew those stories needed to be in this book, even though that chapter was incredibly hard to write.
Então, agora falando sobre poder, você mencionou que os evangélicos ficavam revoltados com os militares norte-americanos no início do século. Então isso mudou e eles se tornaram parceiros praticamente simbióticos. Você poderia nos dizer mais sobre o que aconteceu e como isso aconteceu? E o que eles conquistaram com isso?
Yeah, so I'd say they were ambivalent towards the military in the early 20th century. And in fact, you had a number of conservative Protestants in the United States who were pacifists. And you had a number of conservative Protestants who rejected Christian nationalism. The idea that America was a Christian nation, it didn't make any sense because they understood Christianity in such an individualistic sense. It was your soul had to be saved, and a nation didn't have a soul. So how could you even talk about a Christian nation? Plus, I mean, look around you. Did it look Christian? It was evil everywhere. And so the military too was often seen in evangelical spaces through through World War II, by the way, as a place of corruption. That's a place where good boys would be sent and become corrupted by, sex and drinking and smoking and all of these things that they were trying to protect their boys from. And so the military was looked at with skepticism. And this is, it doesn't fit with the American myth of, the good war, the best war ever, and the greatest generation. But the historical sources make this very clear, and they were not making this up, right? The military was not a place where you saw a lot of virtue. And so then in the years after World War II, evangelicals decide to make the military their mission field, right? So if it's moral corruption, we can go and bring the good news of Jesus there. And that will not just redeem people, but it will reform behavior as well. And so it does become an active mission field. And so you have somebody like Billy Graham visiting the troops and leading crusades in the Korean War. And then, that news of that comes back and it gets promoted, and look at what we're doing in the military, and look how we're raising up these young men. And that starts to change the narrative of what the military is. And that becomes increasingly important by the 1960s. In the 1960s and into the 1970s, when so many Americans, again, with the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement, start to really question not just American foreign policy, but also question the integrity of American soldiers, right? As news of these atrocities starts to filter back and is carried, by the news media into Americans' living rooms and every evening. And these don't seem to be the good guys. And that's when evangelicals insist, yes, they are, right? And we're working with these are good young men, and they're Christian, and many of them are converting to Christianity. And so it's during the Vietnam War that this relationship really becomes cemented. And Billy Graham is really at the heart of that, and really works to promote the vision of not just to convert and support soldiers in Vietnam, but to really burnish the image of the military when it desperately needed to be burnished in America, and in the years after the Vietnam War, when a lot of Americans were really disgusted with the American military, and understandably so. Billy Graham and then other conservative evangelicals really worked to redeem the military. James Dobson played that role prominently in the 1980s and ever since, to really work to help the military rebrand. It was, as you said, symbiotic. It was mutually beneficial. The military, early on thought, sure, if you can, reform these troops and make them, more disciplined, that works for us. And then certainly by the era of the Vietnam War, when they had such a PR problem, to have somebody like Billy Graham advocating on their behalf, and then in the 1980s, having somebody like Dobson, who could reach tens of millions of people every day on the radio. And he was very explicit about rebranding the military. They are heroes. And it was great for Dobson too. First of all, I think he kind of felt cool associating with the military. It kind of, helped his masculinity a bit, maybe. I don't actually say that in the book, but I certainly got that sense reading the sources. But I do know that, it also helped him sell his books, because the military distributed his work throughout the ranks as, promoting family values. And even today, there are connections between, conservative evangelical family values literature and then what's being promoted within the ranks. And again, money is always changing hands here. So this pro-military relationship was both in terms of politics, which I think is more widely known, politics and foreign policy, and this kind of hawkish foreign policy, but it was also these more intimate connections. And then in the book I also talk about Colorado Springs and the Air Force Academy being located just across the street from Dobson's focus on the family. And these connections just continued to remain tight through the 2000s, that's when we see this, it's actually military men who end up authoring many of the books on Christian masculinity. Because it's one thing to have a pastor kind of hold up an aggressive vision of Christian manhood. It's way better if you have a Green Beret who's going to tell you his story of how to be an aggressive Christian man. And so you see this kind of symbiotic relationship just become more and more powerful and tighter as the decades go on, up to today.
Como rolou essa parceria em países invadidos pelos Estados Unidos, como Coreia, Vietnã, Iraque? Os líderes evangélicos defenderam abertamente as atrocidades causadas pelos soldados norte-americanos?
Yes, and yes. All of those they have ignored. They have minimized. So when Billy Graham was talking about the My Lai massacre, basically said, well, we've all done bad things, right? This is unbelievable. Minimization, also defense of remember. They, even North Vietnamese women and children are killing U.S. servicemen. So, rationalizing, justifying these atrocities committed against civilian populations. It's very blatant. And this is a pattern that you see repeatedly. This idea that of embracing preemptive violence. right? Because if you embrace this kind of us versus them mentality, you are either with us or you are against us, and that just permeates conservative white evangelicalism over the last half century, really. So you're with us or you're our enemy. And then the enemies are just there's so much fear is stoked by leaders. You need to be afraid. You need to be afraid of communists, of secular humanists. You need to be afraid of Muslims. You need to be afraid of Democrats, if you will. And the consequences are always dire, and they are going to come and get you. Why would you wait for that to happen? And they'll like use these metaphors of, a man is outside your home and is going to rape your wife. Wouldn't you go and attack him before he gets in your home, right? And so therefore, preemptive war, justified. Forget just war theory. You want to get them because they will get you. One of the most interesting chapters for me to research for this book was the chapter where I look at these fake ex-Muslim terrorists. And it's very bizarre stories. And of these, this is in the years after September 11, 2001. When in aftermath, or during the war on terror, aftermath of 9/11, the evangelical world is really smitten with these men, and there's several of them who claim to have been Islamic terrorists, and they all have these very dramatic stories about how they killed so many people, and then they came to the United States to kill more people and to attack Christians, especially evangelicals, because they were so faithful. And then they become converted to Christianity and to evangelicalism. And then they repent of their ways. And then they go on the speaking circuit to tell evangelicals just how evil and dangerous Muslims are and how they are out to kill them. The problem is all of these guys are frauds. And what I discovered, in part because one of them came to my college campus, and one of my history colleagues discovered this story doesn't add up. My colleague is a historian of the Ottoman Empire, and he knows he knows the history of Islam, and he knew that these guys didn't know what they were talking about. And so this particular guy had been sponsored by Focus on the Family, right? And these guys had the backing of Focus on the Family, of CBN, of the SBC, right? Big backers here. And he called the president, or was able to connect with the president of Focus on the Family. And turns out they knew it too. They knew this guy was a fraud, and they weren't saying it, and they continued to promote. And in these circles, all of these guys have been discredited in the media, and yet they still show up on Christian television, and they continue to spread these lies. Anyway, that was a long digression, but it was an important moment for me. That's kind of when things clicked, because a lot of the narratives around white evangelicalism and politics in recent years have talked about kind of this radicalization or this militancy that we see in terms of culture wars, politics, just in terms of politics generally. The evangelicals are just so afraid, right? They are afraid because of demographic decline. They are afraid because of threats to their religious liberties. They're afraid because of, fill in the blank. And therefore, what choice do they have but to lash out, right? To reach for extremes, to embrace somebody like Donald Trump, right? What choice did they have? They were just so afraid. What I came to see, particularly in light of this, these ex-Muslim terrorists who were none of the above, was that we needed to flip that script, that in many cases, the militancy came first. And then it was evangelical leaders who actively stoked fear in the hearts of their followers in order to consolidate their own power. We see that with Jerry Falwell Sr. and Thomas Road Baptist Church. We see that with these fake ex-Muslim terrorists. We see that in the case of Mark Driscoll. Same sort of thing, inciting fear in order to, he would preach flanked by armed guards to gin up this idea of, we are so under siege. They are out to get us, whoever that they might be. And don't even go to that church down the street, because your eternal salvation will be at stake because their theology is wrong, right? And so this fear was real. It was very real. It is real in the hearts of evangelicals. People are acting out of that fear. That fear is not naturally occurring. That fear has been manufactured, actively stoked by leaders in order to consolidate their own power.
No Brasil, nós não temos esforços de guerra internacional igual nos Estados Unidos, pelo menos não desde o século XIX. Mas nós temos um exército muito forte que foi o responsável pela formação da nossa república e que deu golpes e mais golpes de Estado no século passado, sendo bem-sucedidos em alguns deles. Nossos evangélicos são realmente apaixonados pelos militares, não só pelos militares, mas também pela polícia militar, que é uma das mais violentas do mundo, uma das que mais morre e que mais mata. Algumas pessoas até pensam que estamos em uma guerra civil por causa dessa guerra contra drogas, que mata principalmente a população preta e pobre do povo brasileiro. Como você vê esse evangelicalismo branco legitimando não só a repressão externa nas guerras, mas também a repressão interna?
We have the same patterns here. And I think the clearest example of that is that conservative white evangelical embrace of law and order politics, right? And this is coming out of the 1960s and goes hand in hand with the rise of the religious right and the political realignment that brings our parties into kind of their modern iteration here in the United States, where white conservatives are in the Republican Party, and then progressives and most people who are not white are in the Democratic Party. So this political realignment that is taking place in the 60s and 70s, and evangelicals are helping to create that movement as they move into the Republican Party. And support candidates like Nixon, and then in particular Ronald Reagan. And law and order politics is key here. And this is pro-law enforcement. And in that historical moment, what that looks like is pro-white law enforcement that is being used to suppress the civil rights activists in the 1960s, and increasingly, to enforce order over against protesters and activists. And whether peaceful protests or increasingly as the 60s wear on, what will come to be known as riots. Which there's some important work being done right now by Elizabeth Hinton, really recasting understanding of race riots, or of these riots, and pitching them instead as protest movements, and advocating for equality and resisting police brutality and inequitable treatment. But in those conversations, white evangelicals were remain firmly on the side of white law enforcement. And here too, kind of this heroic masculinity that I write about. So the book is called Jesus and John Wayne, and it's the John Wayne figure is a nod to the importance of popular culture here, and of secular influences of this kind of heroic cowboy masculinity, and this cowboy soldier hero that comes to kind of inspire this very this warrior masculinity in Christian circles. And key to this conception of heroic white masculinity was that these heroic men would use violence in order to achieve order. And John Wayne is a great example, right, in his movies. Here we can also see, though, that there's a whiteness here that is visible if you look. It's white masculinity that is called to use violence. And and it's more often than not, violence against non-white populations. So John Wayne became a movie star first by starring in Westerns, and so as a cowboy hero suppressing Native Americans, and then in Sands of Iwo Jima over against the Japanese, the Alamo against the Mexicans, and the Green Berets against the Vietnamese. And you can just see this pattern. So it's the white man who has the right to use violence, and not just the right, the duty, the obligation. And it is a sacred violence, a righteous violence. And that very much applies to this law and order rhetoric, that it was white men with power who are to use their violence, must use their violence, and it is a sanctified violence over against non-white people and oppressed people. So that would be very consistent, and that has remained consistent for more than half a century. And we see that in survey data over and over again with respect to conservative white evangelical opposition to the Black Lives Matter movement, and trust in law enforcement and defensive law enforcement. You see that in evangelical popular culture. You can find in stores like Hobby Lobby, owned by a powerful evangelical family. They have a lot of decorative items that are, the thin blue line, the police flag, which is seen as really now has come to be a symbol of, pro-law enforcement and anti-Black Lives Matter. You'll see, you can buy wall plaques with Bible verses on them, and police officers, and Bible verses about peace. And you can see, they buy these plaques that have an American flag on it. And I stand for the flag and I kneel for the Lord. So, against the racial justice movement and Colin Kaepernick and so on. So this is very much a kind of the core beliefs of conservative white evangelicals, very pro law enforcement. And if you know what to look for, it's very, race is very much a part of this.
Ainda falando em repressão interna, nós também vemos muita ênfase dos nossos evangélicos brancos brasileiros na família tradicional, mas principalmente contra o feminismo e contra orientações sexuais que não sejam heterossexuais. Além da formação da masculinidade como virtude de guerra, que outras preocupações estão por trás desses posicionamentos agressivos contra a diversidade sexual e feminismo?
Yeah. So I think here there are two topics that I could have gone into much more detail in this book. As I was writing, I kept thinking, should I do more? Should I do more? And I had a deadline, and the book felt sprawling as it was. But those two topics were abortion and LGBTQ rights. And both of those come up in this narrative, but I don't focus on them. I could have focused on them much more. And but I hope that the book provides a context within which we can understand why those two issues became such hot button issues, right? The case of abortion, right? In the late 60s and early 70s, a lot of conservative evangelicals were actually pro-choice. Some were not. Some were pro-life in a way we recognize today. Many were pro-choice, saying it's a really difficult decision. Abortion, anti-abortion was largely a Catholic issue, and conservative evangelicals weren't too keen on Catholics back then, and so it just wasn't their thing. And that changed over the course of the 1970s, both as a reaction to Roe v. Wade, but also very much as a reaction against feminism. And abortion was seen as a violence against, right, not just killing a fetus. That's rhetoric that came later, largely. It was also the concern of a woman's proper role, that it would free her from her maternal duty. And, if women were supposed to be in the home and women were supposed to be wives and mothers, abortion would disrupt that. And so I think abortion has to be understood in this context, right? Not exclusively, but in part, as part of this threat to this, what had become a core value of evangelicalism, which was gender difference. Now, LGBTQ, even more so, right? Gender difference, the whole social order, the whole understanding of a godly social order, which was the foundation for a godly nation, which was, Christian America, this was a beacon for the world. So it was really the fate of Christianity that hung on getting this right. And gender difference was at its core. And by gender difference, I mean, James Dobson said men and women are different in every cell of their bodies. I mean, technically true, but by what he did with that then was like opposites. So if men are this, women are that. And, absolute opposites. So men are aggressive, women are weak. Men like to play sports, women yawn on the sidelines. Just these really ridiculous stereotypes, but he presented them as the word of God. And so you bring in a same-sex relationship, absolutely disrupts this binary of and this polarized conception of gender, and yet that had been so fundamental that this is a real threat, not just to biblical interpretation or the way that they'll frame this as biblical inerrancy or tradition, but also to it was kind of the keystone of their whole ideology. And so I think that this particular history, the narrative that I tell, helps us understand why those two issues became the flashpoints that they did in the 1970s and continue to be today. And although we certainly are seeing movement more so on LGBTQ issues in evangelical communities, particularly with the younger generation, less so on the issue of abortion. That's interesting. Although you see a lot of kind of change within young evangelicals in terms of survey data on a number of issues, or if not change, differences from older generations, issues like immigration and issues, particularly LGBTQ rights. On the issue of abortion, that's where you see very little difference. So that has continued more strongly. I think on LGBTQ, there's so many changes in broader culture and also within Christian circles. In the last 20 years, a lot of gay Christians have come out publicly. A lot of theologians are now saying we need to take another look at the scriptures and maybe we got this wrong. And so I think that there's a lot of movement on that front, and there will continue to be.
Em uma entrevista, você disse que ficou impressionada com a forma como os cristãos eram cegos para os abusos das suas igrejas na sociedade. Mas então você disse que percebeu que, não entrando nesses assuntos, você também estava fechando os olhos. Sendo uma mulher cristã, por que você acha que é tão difícil encarar essa realidade das nossas igrejas?
What I came to see through my research, and I continue to see since the book has come out, is just how powerful the impulse is within evangelical circles to give deference to authority and to refuse to disrupt these power structures, because evangelicals are taught over and over again to respect authority, to submit to authority, to submit to their proper authorities. So women to men, children to parents, men to more important men, to their pastors, to their leaders, to the God-appointed authorities. Now, again, they get to kind of determine which ones are the God-appointed ones and which ones are not. But this, I wasn't prepared for that when I started this research, just how much authority was the focus of a lot of these evangelical teachings. And back in the 1960s already, and all the way up to the present, and how cultures of deference were formed in evangelical churches, in evangelical organizations, and how much that had kept the truth from being told in these spaces, whether it was truth about abuses, whether it was, what people really thought about, social issues or even political issues, even just questioning the consolidation of power in these spaces, usually almost always with white evangelical men at the top. And I decided actually, I mentioned that I started looking into this topic more than 15 years ago. And one of the reasons I'd set the book aside was, first of all, it was really disturbing what I was uncovering. I found, these teachings revolting. This was the height of the Mark Driscoll era. I thought it was anti-Christian, and I found it detestable. And so I wasn't sure, one, if I wanted to spend years immersed in this. It was not really what I was looking forward to doing. But connected to that, I wasn't sure kind of how mainstream this was, and if it was a fringe movement. That's something I wrestled with through the book, and you'll see that throughout. And what is the connection between the extreme and the mainstream? And what I came to see as I researched and as I wrote, that the connection is often very tight between the fringe and the mainstream movement. But I also had this question of, should I, especially if this is more fringe, and I hadn't yet resolved that question, should I, as a Christian, so I'm a Christian scholar, I teach at a Christian university, active member of my church, should I, as a Christian scholar, be shining this bright light on what might be the darkest underbelly of American Christianity, right? Is that what I should be doing? And I thought, maybe not. I don't know. Maybe I don't need to be exposing this to the world, right? It doesn't seem very evangelistic. That was one of many reasons that I set it aside. But I did have that question, and I did feel like it was kind of a noble choice. And I say that now because it wasn't, right? It was exactly what so many Christians have done and continue to do, which is to not speak the truth and not call out what you are seeing, because you want to protect the witness of the church. You want to protect the witness of this pastor or this ministry. You don't want to air your dirty laundry. And I realized that I had that same impulse long ago. And this book would have maybe been written long ago if I hadn't had that impulse. And I see that impulse everywhere. I see it in organizations. I see it in my own institutions that I'm a part of covering things up to protect the witness. And that's why one of my favorite passages in the book is a quote from Rachel Denhollander, who was the first witness in the sexual abuse case outside of evangelicalism, the Larry Nassar case. And then she turned her attention to abuse inside evangelicalism as a conservative evangelical herself. And she ran up against precisely what I describe in this last chapter, the cover-up and victim blaming, and all in the name of protecting the witness. And she said, the gospel of Jesus Christ does not need your protection. Jesus only asks for obedience. And what that looks like is telling the truth and doing justice. And I absolutely love that. So for me as a Christian woman, writing this book, it honestly felt really empowering. It felt really empowering. I've been watching this for almost 2 decades. I've been seeing this around me. It's been incredibly frustrating. People ask if it was, hard to hold on to my faith while I wrote this book. No, it was harder before I started writing it because I was seeing this all, and it actually felt really cathartic to put it all down so that I can hold it up for all to see. It really felt like a testimony. And I made it was an intentional choice to no longer show deference to those who wielded this power. And I think that's really clear in this book, from the book subtitle to the chapter titles to the tone throughout the book. I've just refused to show deference.
Eu só gostaria de dizer que nós nos identificamos profundamente com esse sentimento de catarse. A revista Zelota também foi muito importante para a nossa fé. Mas, chegando no final da entrevista, no seu livro você não dedica muito espaço para a feminilidade das mulheres evangélicas brancas, porque esse não era o foco. Você pode comentar um pouco sobre o seu próximo livro que vai sair, Viva, Sorria e Ame?
As I wrote Jesus and John Wayne, there's one chapter on evangelical femininity that appears very early in the book, chapter 3, and it really sets the stage of this emphasis on femininity, sexual objectification, submission to masculine authority, and domesticity. And that really does hold steady throughout this narrative. But it evolves in really interesting ways. And I knew that I just couldn't go into this. This was a book about masculinity and politics and weaving together a lot of strands between those two topics. So I had to just let the femininity kind of, not quite fall to the side, but there was so much more that could be said. So my next book is called Live, Laugh, Love, and it is a cultural history of white Christian womanhood, also looking at popular culture in particular. So things like inspirational fiction and mommy blogs and HGTV, reality TV and so on. And it's analyzing this white Christian womanhood through the lens of post-feminism, neoliberalism, and white supremacy.
Você poderia nos dar pequeno spoiler sobre o que você tem abordado no novo livro?
My publicist actually does want me to keep things under wraps for the most part. So what I just told you is what I am allowed to say, and that is in the media announcement. And I will say that this summer I'm working with 3 full-time research assistants, and we are finding amazing, amazing things. And I cannot wait to write this all up. It'll be a little bit still because, like Jesus and John Wayne, it is a very deeply researched book. I'm not just spouting off my opinions. So I think I will get in trouble with my publicist if I do.
Uma última pergunta. Eu achei muito engraçado na sua entrevista com o Pete Enns que você contou que a editora estava te pressionando para colocar uma frase esperançosa no final do livro. E como você tem se sentido ultimamente? Você tem se sentido mais esperançosa? Acha que há novas maneiras da gente superar esses problemas? O que você tem sentido em relação a isso?
I would say, yeah, when I got to the end, I'll just say the story so that your listeners can hear too. But when I got to the end of the manuscript, and we were really in this crunch time to get it edited and in production in time for the 2020 election, well in advance of the 2020 election. So time was of the essence. I thought we're pretty much good to go when I get an email from my editor who said, Kristen, this book is really depressing. I was like, yeah. And then he said, you can't leave your readers here. You can't leave your readers in this place. And so I thought, okay, let me see what I can do. And I looked back over the manuscript and I thought, I've got nothing. It is really depressing. I agree. And I can't, I don't know what to do. And so he said, okay, I respect that. And then a couple of days later, he emails again. It's like, Kristen, just give us anything. And so I was like, okay, I've got to do something here. So that's when I gave him the last sentence of the book and kind of reworked the conclusion and said, what was once done might also be undone. And it really felt feeble. I was embarrassed to send that off to him. And he's like, fine, I'll take it. And that was that. And I mean, there's truth to that. And I really believe in the power of history. Particularly for white evangelicals in the United States, because white evangelicals in this country have really worked to control their own narratives. They have told their own histories, right? They have told histories in which they are always the good guys and God is on their side. And they have, packaged and sold so many things as God ordained and biblical that really are not, certainly, are not biblical, or they are much more than just biblical. And so history can demonstrate that so clearly. And what I will say is the book has actually done this. It's been received in remarkable ways in conservative white evangelical spaces, precisely in this way. And for many of my evangelical readers, that last sentence of the book is what they hold on to, because they have now seen, and so many letters I've received, it's got to be well over 1,000 now, of readers who just say, like, this is the story of my life, but I never understood how all these pieces fit together. And now that they do, now that they can see it, they can start to fight against it. They can start to undo it. Until they could see it, they were at a loss, right? And so I'm actually, in some ways, much more hopeful now than I was when I finished the manuscript, because I did not anticipate this response, this enthusiastic response from so many evangelicals themselves. They have promoted this book in very conservative spaces. They have invited me to speak in places I never thought I'd get invited to speak. Sometimes I get disinvited, but most of the time I'm welcomed with great hospitality. And honestly, all it takes is one person to say, hey guys, we need to wrestle with this. There's truth here. And I've been having those conversations. And there are so many people that I would not have thought who are examining their own complicity, right? They're not only saying, I didn't really understand what was going on, they're also saying, why didn't I? Why did I participate in this? Why was I so comfortable in these spaces when when what we were doing was causing so much harm to so many others? So I'm actually more hopeful now, much more than when I finished the book. That said, all of that hope is really based on what I see happening on an individual level. I see very little institutional change happening or on the horizon. Within evangelical institutions, I see retrenchment. I see powerful donors and powerful constituents exerting pressure. I see the status quo persisting, even as individuals who are engaging in this reckoning are, working for change. Many of them are failing. Many of them are losing their jobs or getting forced out of their communities or just saying enough is enough as they leave. Think of people like Beth Moore, people like Russell Moore, as they are leaving those spaces, having tried their best, what happens is those spaces continue to be conservative, if not even now more reactionary, because those voices of dissent are no longer in their midst. And that's what I'm seeing happening across evangelicalism. And so I'm hopeful in terms of the individual change that is absolutely happening. It's really hard for me to gauge how widespread that is, simply because so many of the people who are in this place and who are kind of going through this reckoning are the ones who are reaching out to me. So, hundreds and hundreds every day. I get several messages from readers who are in this space. So that's not a very good sampling of the general population, and that's what I keep in mind. Because again, when I look more broadly, I don't really see this movement going anywhere anytime soon. But I'm a historian. I know nothing about the future. I get the predictions wrong all the time, so I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. It does feel like it is a moment like I've never experienced before in my lifetime, where these divisions are becoming so visible, and these divisions run through families, churches, organizations, communities, and I really don't know what will happen next.
Okay, so I think what you're experiencing it's amazing. It's you really are how do we say it in English, a prophetess for this decade. And I want to thank you so much for accepting to talk to us. I am sure it will make a difference, not only for our Adventist church, but for every church here in Brazil. Mm-hmm. Many of us are struggling with similar things. Our elections are just next year, so yeah. So I see a lot of people. I've been meeting and finding lots of people from different churches who have been struggling with the same things, and they all look up to your work. Because it really is a game changer.
Thank you. And I love talking with you and connecting. And if there's anything that we can do, taking our lessons, our mistakes, and helping to sustain you and your work, please do reach out. And I know there's been some talk of getting a Portuguese translation, and this conversation is a good incentive for me to follow up on that and see if that can be done, particularly with the election next year. So I will see what I can do on that front.
I'm looking forward to reading it in Portuguese, and we will surely promote it.
Thank you so much.
So can you pray for us, so we can end the interview?
Absolutely. All right. Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us together across space and time in recording and hearing. Thank you for the community that you are drawing together, your global church, the communion of the saints, and that we can seek truth together. We pray that you give us clarity. We pray that you give us courage and that you strengthen us to do your will and to obey and to work for shalom, to work for peace, and to work for flourishing. And in your name we pray. Amen.